sure people will be joining us in progress. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Sauce here. I'm the Faculty Associate Director for the Teaching and Learning Center. You found your way to our weekly professional development series, and I'm really glad about that. For those of you attending asynchronously, watching these recordings later, because we record all our events, it's nice to see you. I'm just not seeing you in real time. Every Wednesday at noon, we have a wonderful slate of events. Today is no exception. We'll get to that in a second because I want to begin with a land acknowledgement.
Okay, Don, just give me a thumbs up whenever you see what I want you to see. Okay, great. Here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilized the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism, and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we have a weekly professional development series, noon on Wednesdays. We also archive our events on the TLC website, so these are recorded for later viewing. So after today's event, which is going to be amazing, and you say, my colleagues need to see this, they will have that opportunity. If you attend our events and do some other small things, you can earn a TLC Professional Development Certificate, and my colleagues will drop that information for us into the chat. We have certificates both for graduate students as well as for staff and faculty. If you're a faculty member and you're looking to kind of expand not only your own excellence in teaching, but others as well, you potentially can apply to be a TLC Fellow. We have those opportunities also available at that link. Couple of other announcements I want to put on your radar. Number one, if you're teaching a class with first-year students in it, our student success administrators would be really indebted if you would announce to your first-year students that have a survey that was emailed to them and is waiting for them in Navigate that is kind of asking them how they're doing. So I definitely recommend that if you have that opportunity in first-year students to point them to that survey if they have not already completed. The survey is 13 items and takes less than a minute. I actually had my students do that at the beginning of my Gen Psych class yesterday, and they're actually reaching out to all of the students who have, any sort of need in any of those 13 areas. It's a really, really wonderful effort. So I wanted to put that on your radar. I also wanted to put on your radar that there is an awesome book club coming up in just a little bit on Small Teaching Online. If any of you have seen this book, Small Teaching Online, there's going to be a virtual book club. Information is going to be in our newsletters and things like that. I don't know, Ashley, if you have an easy thing to drop in the chat for information about that. That book club is put on by Susan Parath, and it's a really, really amazing thing. There'll be 3 Fridays that we'll talk about different parts of the Small Teaching Online book. I know I had some conversations with my colleagues this morning about teaching online. This is not going anywhere, so we might as well learn how to do it well. And I think that this book club is a great way to kind of do some of those things. Next week, Tarek Nasser, who's here from our College of Business, will be presenting on a piece of peace, exploring authenticity and how it holds peace together. Peace is a notion that I'm very fond of, so I'm very excited to see that. But before we get Tarek next week, we've got Chase Jordan today. Chase Jordan is amazing. The first time I had ever heard Chase talk about teaching, I was like, we got to find a way to get Chase into this series. So we have done that. And today, Chase is going to be presenting about tools for responsive teaching, strategies for intercultural instruction. Chase, thanks so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Don. Thank you so much for inviting me here to present today. Same kind of with you, Don. Once I attended that first professional development series event last fall, Although it was asynchronous. I did it through the videos. I was like, I gotta get in on this. I gotta do something more with y'all. So I'm really, really excited to actually be presenting for this fall. But I want to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Hopefully, if I've done this correctly, you should be able to see my slides. Go ahead and give me a thumbs up on your screen if you can see. Perfect. I'm seeing lots of thumbs. Awesome. So as Dawn mentioned, today we're going to be talking about some tools for responsive teaching. These are things that you can use and a pedagogy for excellence in instructional design and communication with your students, and to integrate your curriculum with a more varied approach to student expression and identity. There are a lot of heady concepts associated with culture and teaching, and it's such a wide array of literature. However, what I'd like to focus on today specifically is how you can use intercultural experiences and identities and perspectives from all your students to elevate what I call a discourse of discovery. We'll talk more about what that discourse of discovery is and what that can look like for your classroom in just a second. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be talking about some tangential ideas related to this one pedagogical model that I've done a little bit of research on, called interculturally responsive pedagogy, or IRP for short. This field of, again, this model is a fairly, it goes by multiple names. It kind of suffers from the, what is it called? The jingle jangle fallacy that a lot of academics run into. Same terms being used for different ideas, different things being referred to different things. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to center on just this one definition. Interculturally responsive pedagogy is using the the knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of a body of students to make learning more relevant and effective for them. Geneva Gay is a leading author in this field of educational research. They offer a lot of tips and tricks specifically for K through 12 education. However, I feel that as higher education professionals and educators in post-secondary, we can learn a lot from integrating some of these ideas into our own college classrooms. So interculturally responsive pedagogy seeks to do a few different things. First, it affords students opportunities to see themselves in course curricula by teaching to and across cultural contexts. What this means is students not only see course concepts as relevant to them, they actually see themselves as part of the curricular process as a whole from their different cultural perspectives. As we all know from as teachers in higher ed and all of our international students, some of the most incredible experiences I've had as a teacher are with my international students who provide just incredible knowledge that I could not have ever known about in my own field of study even. But as we'll find out, culture is not necessarily restricted to things like nationality. And so interculturally responsive pedagogy seeks to elevate that idea of culture and what that can mean for your students, teaching to those cultural contexts and across them. The second thing interculturally responsive pedagogy seeks to do is integrate student interests and desires for learning into course curricula by facilitating a discourse of discovery in the classroom. Students ultimately are the drivers of our classrooms. Teachers can never truly be the harbinger of knowledge. They facilitate its discovery and embolden those flames of curiosity. Interculturally responsive pedagogy capitalizes on that idea. It says students and their interests can help shape course curriculum from their individual cultural experiences and contexts. So I want to go ahead and go ahead and just pause briefly. I want you to go ahead and do a bit of a waterfall chat for just a couple seconds. I want you to go ahead and in the chat just write down what courses you typically teach and what field that you typically teach in if you're a practicing an instructor. You're teaching psychology courses, if you're teaching education courses, I want you to go ahead and get those ready in the chat and go ahead and post them for me. And what we're going to do, oh, yeah, oh, Farida, I didn't even know you were in here. Hi, Farida. Farida also teaches public speaking as well. But yeah, go ahead and put those in the chat. Finance. Yes. Okay. Okay, so language and pedagogy, linguistics. Ooh, student teaching in 4th grade. Oh, whoa, we got someone teaching research methods in here. Oh, I better get serious. They got the technical knowledge down. Okay, psychology and higher ed, yeah. So we have a lot of different types of people who are teaching here and from a lot of different areas. One of the biggest considerations for interculturally responsive pedagogy is that it does not restrict itself to one particular type of course. That is such an important idea. The idea of like student experiences and integrating those ideas into course curriculum, that is not restricted to teaching things like culture. So I'm not just going to be using interculturally responsive pedagogy if I'm just teaching things like, if I'm teaching culture and context in leadership, right? That's a course we offer over at the leadership studies school. I'm not going to just use it. This is a model for any and all of you. Things like linguistics. Linguistics is a fantastic example. Thank you, Andy. Andy Faber. There are so many different ways in which people can communicate using language that are not universal. The ways we can draw upon students' experiences communicating with each other through symbols and language can help elevate your courses, can help shape that curriculum. So let's go ahead and expand that definition of culture. Interculturally responsive pedagogy diversifies existent cultural knowledge by first approaching culture as multifaceted. Things like culture of race, ethnicity, and nationality are common things that people think of when they think of culture. But other things like culture of gender identity, culture of gender expression, of age, culture of sex, culture of class, education, work, and local community. These things, while we might not see them colloquially and referred to as culture, they're ultimately so important to shaping individual students' self-concepts. This idea that culture is multifaceted, intersectional, that it is a critical part of helping you shape the intercultural classroom, right? And drawing upon student experiences, not limiting yourself to seeing culture as domestic students and international students, but seeing each individual student as bringing them with them cultural elements that make them super, super complex. Right? I myself, right? I identify as a white person. I was born in the United States. I am privileged in a lot of respects, but I also have different aspects of my identities that can intersect with that, right? I identify as non-binary, right? I identify as agender, I identify as queer, right? There is no such thing as someone who has culture and who does not have culture, right? Those critical ideas are so important as a teacher to approach your students with the complexity they deserve, right? Treat them as people who are multifaceted, right? And with teaching, we can elevate their experiences in the classroom by doing a couple things. The first is integrating academic literature that is culturally contextual and is criticized. Okay? What I mean by culturally contextual and criticized, when you are introducing fields of literature into your course structures, you are essentially shaping what knowledge exists for students, especially if you're teaching introductory courses, like public speaking, for instance. It's a gen ed course that I teach, that Farida also teaches. Those concepts, every single student at K-State who wants a degree has to take that course, right? We essentially we decide what knowledge exists for students in public speaking especially if they've never taken a public speaking course before. For an introduction to operations and supply chain management by Brandon Savage. You are the one that decides what is relevant in the classroom and what is not, right? That's a lot of power. That implies a lot of power as to what exists for students to explore. IRP, interculturally responsive pedagogy, says, let's get students involved in that process. Let's let them help shape what they need to know by sharing what they want to know. The one thing that we can do, one way that we can incentivize students to do that is to share literature with them that is from a wide variety of areas and from people of different cultural experiences. Citing scholars of color, for instance, citing scholars, trans scholars, women scholars, right? All of these historically underrepresented groups in academia, sharing those and offering those perspectives up for students to explore, help incentivize them to share their own personal experiences as well, right? Diversify the existent knowledge of the literature, but also of the students' experiences themselves. I also say contingent perspectives, students' experiences and contingent perspectives. Throughout your courses, you're going to have students who introduce knowledge or information in the class that you might not see as immediately relevant. It might put you off a little bit, be like, that's not really within the confines of the course, right? You might be teaching, well, I'll just use my course as an example. Public speaking. If I'm teaching public speaking, some students, they want to learn more about, okay, well, how do I present how do I do public speaking in the context of like a play or a musical? Right? Maybe they're a performative arts students and they're trying to use their public speaking course to try to understand their major better, right? While our course SLOs, our student learning outcomes for public speaking, we don't do any musical or theater performance practicing in that course, right? However, I do not dismiss those perspectives and that thirst for knowledge as irrelevant. I never say it is irrelevant. Instead, interculturally responsive pedagogy makes room for those perspectives, makes room for that desire for learning by incorporating it into the course curriculum. The next thing that interculturally responsive pedagogy does is help foster a comfortability with vulnerability. When discussing issues of culture and difference, race, ethnicity, power, people can feel very, very odd. They can feel weird. And that is incredible. As teachers, we want to use that uncomfortability, that vulnerability that students share by telling their experiences, by expressing their desire for learning, their specific desires, what they have experienced in the past and what they're bringing through those classroom doors. We want to make use of them, and we want to share that comfortability with students. Say this is a safe space. Not only is it a safe space, but it's a place where we're going to interrogate those ideas by sharing them with the respect that they deserve. I'm going to go ahead and take a little pause. I want to go ahead and just ask you, what are you all thinking? What questions do you have so far about interculturally responsive pedagogy as kind of this model or perspective of teaching? What do you like? What don't you like?
So Chase, I just dropped into the chat a question that I know I have about this is, kind of talking about you fostering the comfortability with vulnerability. How do you get students to kind of do that, right? We inherently don't want to be uncomfortable. How do we get them to kind of see the necessity of that discomfort that sometimes comes with being vulnerable, or to recognize that your perspective is not the only one?
Yes. Okay. So fantastic question. One of one of the strategies that Geneva Gay mentions in their works is using your own personal experiences to humilify, or to, in the classical sense, humiliate yourself as a teacher. Open the doors for more intimate conversation with students. Now, as an instructor, that can be very difficult, especially if you have, if you struggle to communicate those strong and intense feelings that you have, and then the things that you have been through, and those difficult or complex, interesting ideas to students. If you struggle with that can be a real challenge to do. So what I highly recommend is, in addition to attempting to do that, to humilify yourself as an instructor to your students, sharing information that makes it impactful for you, also be sure to have opportunities throughout your classes to get them to talk with each other. Peer interaction, as we'll talk about in just a moment, is critical to the success of discovering those perspectives. Having students collectively discover the knowledge in the course is essential for effective teaching, not an impartment of knowledge, right? This is not a transactional this is not a linear process of, I, as the teacher, have the knowledge that you lack and I'm pouring it into your head. Rather, you discover from what you know and from what we're all criticizing and investigating, what you can find. How interculturally responsive pedagogy essentially is identifying the pathways students can demonstrate their knowledge and their pathways to arriving at those discoveries. That's the whole point. It is not a recitation of knowledge, but rather it's an exploration of what they see as relevant, and how we as professors and teachers can draw out that knowledge. Does that answer your question, Don?
I think it helps me to think about my question. I think it's a question that's not easily answered, but I definitely appreciate what you've guided me toward. There's a number of other kind of comments in the chats. I can give them to you, or you can look at them yourself, whatever is your preference.
Actually, for the sake of the video, why not just go and read them to me?
Excellent. So Tarek says that they see authenticity as fostering comfortability with vulnerability. Ted mentions, I always appreciate when students and instructors are willing to be vulnerable in the classroom. It can be a great way to connect to course concepts, as you discussed, so long as the speaking party is comfortable being vulnerable and we're not forcing students to be vulnerable, only allowing them to do so should they choose. Natalie adds, I think there's always great theoretical guidelines in the area, then putting into actual practice is sometimes where I get stuck. You appear to foster from day one versus a one topic instance. And I'll kind of add in a question later where someone says they worry about crossing the line with younger students. And I get the sense this is more in a K to 12 kind of situation. So you've talked about this a little bit in answering my question, but are there any kind of additional practical recommendations either now or throughout the rest of the conversation about how to actually do this and with different than groups and ages of students?
Yes. Number one, I want to say, I want to highlight before I get to that. Theodore, you mentioned students choosing to be vulnerable is a critical part of facilitating effective conversations with students, as opposed to letting them ruminate in that uncomfortability. We don't want them to ruminate. We want them to enter a growth cycle. There it is. I forgot to click the animation. Enter a growth cycle. Part of that requires students to become vulnerable and make the choice to be vulnerable. Capitalizing on that is essential to allowing them to explore the content with ease, as opposed to kind of rubbing unnecessary and unjustified cultural tensions across students. You also mentioned, yes. So in the context of adults, for younger students. So, okay. And yeah, I think, Dan, I assume you are talking about K through 12. Okay. Yes. So, this form of, like this teaching model is, as I mentioned, very broad. the ways in which you implement interculturally responsive instruction in K through 12, and did you mention you were teaching fourth grade, yes? Yes, okay, especially for that age range, is going to be critically different. From what I'm sharing with you today is more of like an andragogical demographic or teaching for like young adults, essentially. But as I mentioned, the works of Geneva Gay specifically deal with K through 12 and early childhood development and that specific age range for learning. I highly encourage you to seek out those works. I will also share these slides so that you have that reference for you available to you. But for the sake of today's presentation, and doing this in the college classroom, that's going to be different, right? How you probe students for their knowledge and their experiences, you have to treat that with a different degree of care, so as not to, spark rumination among particularly younger students. But yes, as you mentioned, Dawn, doing this and thinking about it, different things. And so you actually set me up for just the perfect transition. So thank you so much. How do we actually do this thing? By facilitating a discourse of discovery. This is the responsive teaching component of interculturally responsive pedagogy. The first thing we need to understand, as we kind of touched upon, as someone mentioned earlier, knowledge is not a thing to be acquired from a teacher. It is not something that it can be poured into your brain. It is something you discover. The way that I describe this, think of knowledge as an exploratory dynamic of communication, rather than isolated impartment of those ideas from a teacher to a student, okay? Or from one teacher to a lecture hall of students, okay? Hence the phrase discourse of discovery. The entire process revolves around thinking of curricular design as a kind of like an improv comedian. I do not want to say no. I want to say yes and. I'm going to give you a couple examples of what that can look like in a public speaking context. When I teach public speaking, obviously I have a wide variety of people who choose a lot of different topics. A lot of public speaking instructors will use what are called topic proposals before they give their speeches to kind of give the instructor a sense of like, okay, is this a good topic or a bad topic? Is this a good thing for me to talk about in class, or is this something I should avoid? Right? I deliberately choose not to do topic proposals in that traditional sense. There's a reason why. Instead of saying students, hey, submit to me a 50 to 100 word topic proposal that elaborates on what you might be talking about. Instead, I say, come and talk with me and have a conversation about it. Whenever I have students do that, whenever I've done this, students have I've seen engagement skyrocket for students, not just engagement and participation on speech days when they're giving their performances, but also during the actual assessment process, when they're crafting their outlines to submit to Canvas, when they are performing their speeches for me in student workshops, right? A lot of times students will come to me with basic topics, right? For example, I had a student who submitted, did not submit. They mentioned that their topic, they wanted to do a demonstration speech, right? How to demonstrate how to do something. They wanted to do a demonstration speech on how to open a door, which is I would imagine many of y'all would think that's a very, very simple, perhaps a bit too simple of a topic. But I do not want to say no. I want to say yes and. What I do is in those moments, I make sure to integrate other students' perspectives and ideas so that they can identify ways to help improve that student's topic or their framing of their topic. So I will call upon other people to say, what do you think about this topic, class? What do we think, right? I might put them into small groups and say, what do we think about our topics? How can we improve them? During this particular student's workshop period, what ended up happening was I had another student who was from South Korea, right? They were from South Korea. They said, you know, I find this topic interesting in that you have in that you have mentioned these ideas of like how to open a door. There's different ways in which people can like approach accessibility in buildings. And as a South Korean disabled person, they were like, in South Korea, there's so many different technological advancements in how people access buildings and the levels of accessibility for them. And then the other student who proposed the topic was like, yeah, that's kind of what I was going for. Despite not having it written anywhere, what was happening was students were diving into the different ways that the student was engaging with the content and thinking about the content, and having other students express their perspectives to help recontextualize their topic. So I don't want to say no, I want to say yes and. And after that, the student gave a wonderful speech on how to implement more accessible doorknobs in Kedzie Hall, because we still have those knob levers in there. So they were like, hey, here's some ways that we can actually go about improving accessibility. Turning a topic of how to open a door versus and elevating it into something truly special. That would not have been possible had I just said, no, choose a different topic. I want to be responsive to students' interests. But there are other ways to do this besides just having a student workshop for a particular assignment. You can also implement strategies by making sure what I call your teaching toolbox is full. When I say responsive teaching, a lot of times people get the wrong idea and they think that the curriculum itself, that there is no curriculum. When I've described it to people, they're like, oh, that seems like so you don't prep anything. It's like, well, no, hold on. No, I do prep. But the difference between kind of a traditional lecture style course and responsive teaching is that instead of having a specific lesson plan that outlines everything that I do, instead, I have a series of tools or instructional materials that I can levy on the spot in class, depending on what students want from me and what they need to achieve those learning outcomes. So for example, for my day when I teach speech delivery, right, I have a few tools in my teaching toolbox. I have what's called a gesture off improv activity, where I take students outside and I have them continuously move their bodies for 1 minute at a time over a prompt. They have 5 seconds to prepare their responses to the prompt, and they have to continuously move their bodies, practice delivery in multiple ways, right? Ways to use emphatic gestures versus illustrative gestures. I also have an activity where we do a speech analysis. I'll pull up a video that I have pre-prepared, and we will analyze a specific portion of a speech and how students have engaged with what the speaker is doing with their body. I also have an activity where students break into small groups and identify speeches from our previous class periods that they feel are relevant to today's class period and interrogate them using delivery, right? So I'll say, so remember when we talked about how to construct main points? You can bring that same speech we talked about and criticize it for its delivery as well. We might bring back to a large group style discussion over why those speeches were so impactful based off of their delivery, right? So I have a lot of different things. Obviously, I don't do all of these things in one class period. It's not possible. I only have, for sometimes I only have 50 minutes. Other times, hour 15. I can't do all of them. But what I do have is the option to decide what students need to know most. How do I know? I will sometimes use these things called curriculum tickets. Curriculum tickets, basically what they are is they are note cards. I bring note cards with me every single day to class. Students, on days that I decide to use this, students will pick up their curriculum ticket, completely blank note card. And what they'll do is they will respond to a few prompts that I have prepared. I'll give you a couple examples of some prompts that I have prepared to give you a sense of how I gauge students' interest for that day or after class as well. What is one thing you would like to know about what we did not explore in class that day? Or what is one thing you would like to know about today's topic? Very simple. We're talking like one sentence, maybe two, right? This should take maybe less than a minute for students to complete. Just something that's like, boom, off the top of your head, what do you want to know? Or what was something that you want to know that we didn't talk about? I might also include on there, how can I use this or this topic or this idea when I need to blank, when I need to do something, or when I need to give how can I use visual aids when I need to give a presentation in my business class I'm taking this semester? How can I use appropriate language use when I need to address a diverse array of audience members? How can I use public speaking materials from our workshops and implement those into note cards, right? From this, I can gauge what students need to know. I'll take maybe 30 seconds to let students write these things down. I will collect those note cards, and then I will very, very briefly, identify commonalities between those note cards, those curriculum tickets. And based off that, I will shape that day's class period on the fly, not on the fly, on the spot, right? Based off of what I have in my teaching toolbox. Okay? Whatever materials I have for that day, I adapt based off what I get from those curriculum tickets, be it the beginning of the class period or at the end of the previous class period. You can use these again, like at the beginning or the end, to gauge what students have need more time to talk about, or they need to be pointed to different resources, right? I highly recommend having some resources available for that day's concepts that you don't necessarily have time to teach, but you can give, if you have a website that you can link them to, or some articles that you want to link, have those available to you so you don't have to always feel like you need to lecture on every single thing that feels relevant. You can outsource that work to students, right? Responsive teaching adapts. So I want to go ahead and pause for a second. And I want to ask what questions you have about deploying your teaching toolbox in the context of responsive teaching. What questions you have about responsive teaching as a process that is not necessarily unplanned, but less traditionally structured? What questions do y'all have? What are you thinking? Hi, Natalie. Yep. Inventory that. Yes. Take an inventory. I highly recommend, and I do this as well. For every single semester, I create a new folder, a new file in my OneDrive specifically for all even the potential materials that could possibly be relevant for any day. And I just can pull up that file on the fly and be like, boom, okay, let's go. Let's switch. Let's do this right now. Not only does it allow for effective responsive teaching, but it also, in the event that you need to pivot, pivoting is the way we do things here. That's how we do things. We pivot based off of your needs, right? As a student, right? Andy asks, excuse me, let me get this one before here. Are you realistically following up / addressing what each student puts on their ticket? So when yes. So short answer, yes, kind of. I will keep those tickets and bring them with me. I have a whole box in my office of just curriculum tickets. And I will interrogate those further at the end of the class, after class periods. When I have my student meeting hours, I go through those tickets and I look for a variety of things. So if I use those curriculum tickets at the beginning of the class period, I've kind of already done a little bit of investigation of what commonalities are on those note cards. However, if I use those curriculum tickets at the end of the class period, what I'm going to do is when I'm looking over those note cards later in my office, I am not just restricting myself to common things students are saying on their note cards. I am also specifically looking for outliers, because interculturally responsive pedagogy does not simplify culture into a monolith. Culture is not a monolith. So I'm looking for perspectives as well that deviate from the norm. And I'm saying, how might this be relevant? How might this student have arrived at this question or this response to the prompt? What ways can I use that information to inform my next class period? For example, if I have a student who has, so actually I'll use an actual example. So I had a student who at the end of the class period on their curriculum ticket, I believe the prompt that I used that they responded to was, what is one thing you would like to explore in the next class period that we couldn't cover this class period? And they responded, as someone who has a stutter, how can I communicate to people who speak English? Excuse me, no. As someone who is ESL and has a stutter, how can I communicate effectively to people who speak English as a first language but don't speak any other, excuse me, that people who don't speak other languages? How can I, as a person who has a stutter, adapt to that? And I was like, wow, that's a fantastic question, because we don't really cover, like, I'm not a speech therapist or speech counselor, right? So I was like, this is a great common question that I'm surprised I didn't think about. And so what I did the next class period was I had a period at the beginning of the class where I brought in kind of some materials I found and did some kind of preliminary research, secondary research into that idea. And what we did was I pulled up an article that provided some suggestions for people who are ESL and have communication, well, we call them deficiencies. They're not deficiencies, but who have those variations, communication variations, and provide suggestions for how they can adapt their communication styles and provide effective and appear credible in their speeches. And I made it very, very clear. I was not an expert. I'm not a speech pathologist. I'm not a speech therapist. Excuse me, that was a very loud motorcycle. But I integrated that into the next class period's curriculum to adapt to that person's question that I feel was really, really relevant. But I do not individually have a conversation with every single student about what they have on their note card. That would not be logistically feasible and not good interculturally responsive pedagogy, because I want them to collectively share their experiences as opposed to just having one-on-one conversations with them. Because I, in a position of power, am limited by my perspectives. Whole point of this is to get students to be integrated into that curricular process. And okay, so Annie asked, what strategies do you use when something culturally insensitive comes up in the class? And I believe that relates to a question I saw earlier in the chat. How would you recommend balancing? Yeah, how would you recommend balancing theories and findings from traditionally white men and scholars with scholars representing other groups and identities? So what I do is I make sure to criticize the text that I levy. Always. Regardless of the speech, I am identifying what cultural identities I am omitting, what cultural identities this piece does not cover, and ways in which we can learn from the piece and integrate them for other experiences, other texts that we have talked about in the course. I am relating the text to each other. They are not independent from one another. So if I have an article, say like as a rhetoric scholar, if I'm going to cite Kenneth Burke, right? Kenneth Burke, dramatism. How many of you remember that from Rhetoric 101? But very white dude, very, very privileged, very, very influential scholar. I'm going to make sure that I say, hey, Kenneth Burke's works in dramatism are relevant to today's discussion, but they specifically do not, their works have been criticized heavily for oversimplifying queer performative acts and gendered performative acts. They make them it has a very, very traditionalist perspective of what communication and rhetoric can look like. So I'm going to say that. I'm going to say this is what is missing from today's speech, from today's lecture, from the class period in this text, right? And then we can also launch into a discussion about the specifics as well. What are some ways to fill our toolbox with more tools when we are starting out as instructors? From Theodore. Speaking with peers, colleagues who teach similar subjects comes to mind. What other recommendations do you have? General experimentation, new activities, assignments, etc. So filling your public speaking toolbox is one of the most fun things as of this job. I recommend doing not just having discussions and having conversations with other people in your field, but deliberately doing teaching observations of people not in your field. The ways in which people use instructional materials changes depending on what they're teaching, obviously. Sounds simple, but one of the best things you can do, if you want to fill that toolbox, if you want to fill that inventory, with as much things as possible, watch as many teaching engagements as you can, doing as many teaching observations as you can feasibly do. Engage with as many educators from differing perspectives as you can from all over the academy. I have found materials that I might not necessarily use myself. Say from like the biology department comes to mind. Friend from the biology department. They use instructional materials that are like for their labs that I'm like, yeah, we don't do labs in speech. We don't do that. But I'm like, I'm gonna take note of this, because not only will it potentially help me down the line adapt them to what I'm doing, but it also gives me a more worldly perspective as a teacher, and how people are how people are integrating different forms of engagement with their students to different audiences. In this case, students of different courses. And then, of course, just save everything. Ask for materials. Ask for everything. Ask an instructor you just observed. Ask for their teaching materials if they are comfortable with doing so, providing a basic outline if they have any of an activity. Ask, ask, ask. You'll never fill that toolbox if you don't ask for the tools. Okay, Maria says, I think that's something I do that relates to the teaching toolbox is have a weekly discussion board where students can post questions about the content we discussed that week. I can quickly gauge with concepts we need to go over more in class, which concepts are clear to them and which concepts they are really interested in if they ask a lot more questions about it or post links or articles related to that concept. Yes, having discussion boards can be fantastic. I try to do discussions in class as much as possible, but for logistical, like if you were looking for a good way to just implement those discussions if they're not logistically feasible all the time for your course, depending on the technicality of the course, you might consider doing those through Canvas or online. And then, of course, like having a suggested list of resources you can point students to on the fly if need be. Those discussion boards can be very helpful, especially for having a record of all those things. Very, very easy record to keep throughout the course. Now, I do want to go ahead and talk a little bit about, just go a little bit more about facilitated discussions. I know this is a sub point on this slide, but these are some things that I feel can really, really dig at what students are missing, or excuse me, that teachers are missing when they are trying to get to the real meat of what a student is trying to convey. This is going to be especially helpful for navigating cultural tensions across those aspects of culture that we just explored. And I'm borrowing these a little bit from the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art, their visual thinking strategies techniques. One of the questions they say that I love it. What do you see, hear, or feel that makes you say that? When you are navigating a large group discussion, students are going to point to observations in the text, the concepts that you've just defined. They're going to be pointing to things and saying, I think this, but they don't elaborate on it. They don't provide much substance to it, right? But we do not want to ostracize students for that. Instead, we want to dig deeper using this probing question. What What do you see that makes you say that? Right? If a student's asking me about asking like about visual aids, and they're like, well, how do I know if a visual aid is appropriate to use? I say, well, it's got to be easily and readily visible to all audience members. And they say, well, and then I ask them a follow-up question. I say, well, what visual aid are you planning on using? And they're like, well, a PowerPoint. I'm like, okay. So what do you see in your upcoming speech that makes you want to use a PowerPoint? Tell me more about that, right? What do you see in your speech that makes you want to use a PowerPoint? Right? I'm digging deeper. I'm trying to dig more at the reasons why they're saying the things they're saying. Right? Another one is, what more can we find? When you're asking a question of students, be like, what do we think about this class? Dead silence. When students say nothing and they just stare at you, this is the question to use. What more can we find? Incentivizing the discovery of knowledge, right? There is no one correct answer here, right? We're simply exploring what is presented in front of us. Use this prompt when you find yourself sitting in silence amongst a group of students when you've just asked a question. And then finally, the 3 words. This isn't even a question, but it's a request. But it's 3 words, 3 magical words. Tell me more. Tell me more. This is a critical part of not just facilitating that discourse of discovery and learning in your class. It is also an essential part of active listening. It is a core component of active listening. Tell me more can do a lot of different things. It can inspire students to obviously elaborate on what they are saying, but it can also allow them to clarify their responses, right? Sharing someone who's being vulnerable in those moments and sharing a cultural experience that is niche or very, very different from what other students in their class have experienced, that can be uncomfortable. Sometimes when they're responding to a question and offering that perspective, they might not get it. They might not convey the information in a coherent manner the first time. And that's okay. Tell me more can give them an opportunity to try again. It gives them that opportunity to say, tell me more about what you've just said, especially if you, as the instructor, cannot really relate to that experience that they have provided. Use these 3 prompts. Use them. When you are engaging with students in discussions. Again, we are not acting as the harbinger of knowledge here. Students have that responsibility. They are the ones who are being prompted to explore the information. We are simply facilitating that exploration process. So before I go ahead and open it up to all questions for a couple minutes, do you want to offer say that there are some considerations and challenges to this? First, navigating unproductive tensions in the classroom. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because they're fairly simple. But when you are engaging students, especially digging deep for those vulnerable moments, it can be very awkward for students. And sometimes those responses they provide or those experiences they share in peer-to-peer interactions can be unproductive. As the instructor, it is your job to facilitate those tensions so that they become productive, right? Entering a growth cycle, it cannot be accomplished by just making students feel uncomfortable on their own. It requires an effective facilitation of those tensions that make them productive. The second another challenge is that there are potentially programmatic and logistical concerns, especially if you have fairly technical courses or skills-based courses that require a lot of that have student learning outcomes that are highly specific. If you're teaching like a computer programming course, like a computer science course, a lot of that technical information is going to be it's going to be difficult for you to integrate moments like those that become easily relatable to students' intercultural experiences. That doesn't mean it's not possible. it just takes a lot more time to recontextualize those learning outcomes, or excuse me, those student experiences and how they relate to the learning outcomes of the course. So keep that in mind. Always have your SLOs in mind. And then finally, the instructor breadth of knowledge in the literature. In order to facilitate effective responsive teaching, you have to be a specialist in the breadth of literature, right? Sometimes when course coverage can be a challenge. We just had a faculty member who were last fall who had to teach a leadership, I believe it was a leadership communication course, one of those courses. But they were informed that they had to teach it just 2 weeks before the start of the fall semester without having taught it before and not being a specialist in that area of the field. Now, they're, of course, an excellent teacher and they did an awesome job, but sometimes your expertise and what you need to teach don't necessarily line up. So facilitating interculturally responsive pedagogy, it's limiting. It can be very difficult to do that because you don't necessarily have that inventory built up yet, right? And that experience teaching the course and getting doing that kind of like that experimental phase of a first semester teaching a new course. So that can be challenging to be able to respond, to have the curriculum adapt to the student needs if you don't know the breadth of literature. But I want to go ahead and close this down here. And I want to open up to any last remaining remarks or questions or comments from anyone at all.
So Chase, well, the last comment that you made, being knowledgeable about the literature. So are you talking about the toolbox literature, or are you talking about the course that I'm teaching? I'm familiar with that literature.
So in a way, I'm talking about kind of both. So what I mean by instructor breadth and knowledge in the literature, I'm referring to your breadth in applying that knowledge in the context of your teaching. So if this is the first time you have taught a course, even though like for instance, part of my research is an instructional communication. While I know quite a bit in the field of instructional communication, I don't necessarily have a breadth of knowledge in applying that literature specifically to teach undergraduate students. So when I, as an instructor, who's the first time teaching that, if it's my first time teaching it, I don't necessarily have that inventory of materials to integrate with the literature that I'm trying to get students to engage with. So simply being an expert on the topic and being and having the experience teaching that topic can be they can be different. Those levels of experience can be different. So having materials like that, having a good sense of how your course generally operates, how the course SLOs, student learning outcomes, are traditionally met, that's going to be essential for you to effectively facilitate responsive teaching. Does that answer your question? Okay. What else?
I want to thank you for an amazing presentation today on responsive pedagogy, and I really appreciate that at the end, especially. We got some really clear things that we can practically do in our classes starting tomorrow, which we should. So I really do appreciate that. And please, everyone, help me thank Chase for this wonderful presentation. We'll let y'all know that we have a post-event survey that is in the chat. We'd love you to complete. Remind you, we meet every Wednesday at noon over Zoom. We also archive these for asynchronous viewing. This will be posted on our website later today. Next week, Tarek Nasser will be presenting on A Piece of Peace, exploring authenticity and how it holds peace together. We're definitely looking forward to that. And again, thank you so much for finding your way to our professional development series and for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Chase.
Bye-bye, everyone.